Frank Wilson was no stranger to solitude. His property, nestled at the edge of a sprawling suburban neighborhood, was his retreat from the chaotic world he had long learned to distrust. The lot was more than a home, it was a sanctuary, a sprawling piece of land with lush greenery, a modest yet sturdy house, and the crowning jewel of it all, a massive black oak tree. The tree, easily over 200 years old, was a living monument to resilience, having weathered countless storms, droughts, and the encroaching urbanization that had transformed the surrounding landscape. It stood tall, its thick, gnarled branches stretching toward the sky, casting long, cool shadows over the property during the scorching summer months. Frank often said the oak had more personality than most people he knew, and he had every intention of preserving it for future generations. Frank's connection to the oak wasn't purely sentimental. He had recently been in talks with a nearby university that specialized in environmental research. They had expressed interest in the tree for its unique genetic makeup, and he was finalizing a deal that would not only preserve the oak, but also provide him with a financial boost. The plan was simple: allow the university to take non-invasive samples, catalog the tree as part of their long-term research program, and in return, Frank would receive a generous payment enough to fund long-overdue repairs to his house and possibly a vacation he had postponed for years. For once, everything seemed to be aligning in his favor. The morning the tree vanished began like any other. Frank had spent the previous day tending to his property, raking leaves and checking the perimeter for signs of wear or trespass. It was a ritual for him, one born from years of living on land that bordered a neighborhood association he had never joined. The neighbors, most of whom were members of the association, had always looked at Frank's property with a mix of curiosity and disdain. While their neatly trimmed hedges and matching mailboxes adhered to the association's rigid, aesthetic standards, Frank's lot was a wild, untamed oasis. He refused to let anyone dictate how he should care for his own land. The oak tree, with its sprawling roots that sometimes extended into neighboring yards, had become a symbol of his independence. It was also, he suspected, a source of irritation for certain neighbors who valued symmetry over substance. That morning, as Frank pulled into his driveway after an early errand to pick up supplies, he immediately felt that something was wrong. The driveway, which usually lay under the protective canopy of the oak, was bathed in harsh sunlight. He stepped out of his truck, squinting against the glare, and for a moment he couldn't process what he was seeing. The tree was gone. Not damaged, not reduced to a stump. It had simply disappeared. The ground where it had stood was now a disturbingly clean patch of fresh, compacted dirt. There were no sawdust remnants, no stray branches, not even the telltale marks of heavy machinery that would have been needed to remove something so massive. Frank walked toward the spot, his boots crunching against the gravel of the driveway. As he got closer, a sickening sense of unreality settled over him. He crouched and ran his fingers through the dirt. It was freshly packed, damp in places, and smelled faintly of chemicals. His mind raced with questions. Who could have done this? Why? And how had they managed it so seamlessly? He glanced toward the property line, hoping one of his neighbors might have seen or heard something, but the other houses seemed as oblivious as ever, their blinds drawn and curtains fluttering in the breeze. The oak's absence was more than a visual shock. It was an assault on Frank's sense of security. He prided himself on his vigilance and had invested in a simple but effective system of cameras to monitor his property. Yet, as he checked the feed on his phone, his frustration grew. The footage from the previous night showed nothing unusual, just the tree standing in its usual place, swaying gently in the evening wind. Then, at some point after midnight, the feed cut to static for a full 15 minutes. When it resumed, the tree was gone. Frank's first instinct was to confront his neighbors. He grabbed his hat, locked the front door, and marched toward the closest house. It belonged to the Martins, an elderly couple who had lived in the neighborhood even longer than he had. They were the type to notice everything and the least likely to withhold information. Mrs. Martin answered the door, her brow furrowing with concern as she saw the look on Frank's face. "Good morning, Frank," she said cautiously. "Is everything all right?" "No," Frank replied bluntly. "My tree's gone." Mrs. Martin blinked. "Gone? What do you mean, gone?" "I mean, it's not there anymore," Frank said. struggling to keep his frustration in check. "Did you hear anything last night?" "Trucks, chainsaws, anything." She shook her head slowly, her expression shifting from concern to confusion. "We went to bed around 10, and it was quiet as always." "Are you sure?" "I'm sure," Frank interrupted, realizing how absurd he must sound. "Thanks anyway." The rest of the morning passed in a blur of dead ends. None of the other neighbors had seen or heard anything unusual, and those who were part of the neighborhood association seemed oddly tight-lipped when Frank mentioned the tree. By the afternoon, he had called the local police department to report the incident. The officer who arrived was polite but unimpressed. "You're saying someone stole your tree?" the officer asked, scribbling notes on a pad. "That's exactly what I'm saying," Frank replied. The officer glanced at the patch of dirt, then at Frank's house, his expression unreadable. "I'll file the report, but I have to be honest, this isn't exactly a priority case." Frank bit back a sharp retort. He knew it wasn't the officer's fault, but the indifference stung. After the officer left, Frank sat on his porch, staring at the empty space where the oak had stood. He tried to think rationally. Whoever had taken the tree hadn't done it on a whim. This was a calculated act, one that required planning, equipment, and most likely cooperation. But who would go to such lengths? And why? As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the yard, Frank felt a knot of determination tighten in his chest. He didn't have all the answers yet, but he knew one thing for certain: he wasn't going to let this go. The tree had been more than a fixture on his property. It had been a part of his life, his legacy. And if someone thought they could take that from him without consequence, they were about to learn just how wrong they were. Frank spent the rest of the day wrestling with a restless mix of anger and confusion. Every possible explanation for the disappearance of the tree only led to more questions. He thought about the police officer's skeptical attitude and how dismissive his neighbors had been. But this wasn't paranoia or a misunderstanding. Someone had stolen a tree worth tens of thousands of dollars from his property, and they had done it with a level of precision that seemed impossible. Frank wasn't a man to sit idly by when something this outrageous happened, but his frustration was compounded by a stark reality: he had no idea where to begin. The first thing Frank did the next morning was call the landscaping companies in the area. If someone had removed a tree that size, they would have needed professional equipment and expertise. He hoped to catch someone off guard with a direct question or find a paper trail, but none of the companies he called claimed to know anything about it. Most of the conversations ended with polite confusion or vague promises to let him know if they heard anything. He didn't believe them. At least one of these companies had to be lying, and it would just be a matter of figuring out which one. Still, with no leads to go on, Frank felt increasingly cornered. By the afternoon, his determination turned to suspicion. The tree had been gone for less than 48 hours, but the patch of earth, where it had stood, was already looking unnaturally settled, as though someone had gone to great lengths to erase all signs of disruption. The soil had been smoothed over with care, leaving no trace of roots, branches, or bark. It was too clean, too deliberate. Whoever had done this had either been incredibly careful or had professional knowledge of how to cover their tracks. Frank began pacing the perimeter of his property, scanning the ground for anything that might have been overlooked. He was looking for tire tracks, loose branches, or even footprints, anything that might point to who was responsible. After nearly an hour of combing the area, he found a single clue: a faint mark on the edge of his gravel driveway. It looked like the impression of a heavy-duty tire, perhaps from a truck or some kind of construction vehicle. The realization was like a jolt to his system. Someone had driven onto his property, stolen his tree, and then left without so much as a sound. The weight of the situation began to settle on him. This wasn't just theft, it was an invasion of his privacy, a deliberate violation of the space he had spent years protecting. Frank clenched his fists, a fresh wave of anger surging through him. If someone thought they could get away with this, they were sorely mistaken. He went back into the house, grabbed his phone, and began scrolling through his contact list until he found the number for his lawyer, Greg. Greg wasn't a flashy attorney, but he was dependable and had handled a property dispute for Frank years ago. If anyone could help him untangle this mess, it was Greg. Frank's call to Greg was both a relief and a wake-up call. After Frank explained the situation in detail, Greg was silent for a moment before finally speaking in his calm, measured tone. "Frank, this is unusual to say the least. I've handled a lot of cases involving property disputes, but I've never seen anything like this. If someone went to the trouble of removing a tree like that, there's got to be a bigger reason behind it. Are you sure there's nothing else going on? No recent conflicts with your neighbors? No zoning changes or construction projects nearby?" Frank thought about it. There had been tension with the neighbors before, especially with those who were part of the neighborhood association. They had always been vocal about their desire for uniformity, often complaining about his property being out of sync with the rest of the area. But as far as Frank knew, nothing significant had happened recently. He told Greg about the neighbors' complaints over the years, but even as he spoke, it didn't feel like a complete answer. "I don't know," Frank admitted. "This feels bigger than someone just being annoyed about their view." Greg sighed on the other end of the line. "All right, here's what we'll do. I'll file a formal inquiry to see if there have been any permits issued in the area for tree removal or heavy equipment use. That should give us a better idea of who's been working nearby. In the meantime, I'd suggest documenting everything. Take pictures of where the tree was, write down the dates and times of when you noticed it was gone, and keep a record of anyone you've spoken to about it. The more evidence we have, the better." Frank agreed and hung up, feeling a small measure of hope. At least now he had a plan of action. He spent the next few hours meticulously photographing the site where the tree had stood, capturing every angle and detail. He also made notes about the tire marks he had found, even though they were faint and incomplete. By the time he finished, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the yard. He stood there for a moment, staring at the empty space where the oak had once loomed so proudly. It was a hollow, unsettling sight. That night, Frank barely slept. His mind raced with scenarios, each more troubling than the last. He couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just about the tree itself, but about something deeper, something that had been brewing beneath the surface for a long time. The neighbors' cold indifference, the suspiciously clean site, the gaps in the camera footage, all of it pointed to a calculated effort to erase the tree and everything it represented. The next morning, Frank decided to confront the issue head-on. He drove to the office of the neighborhood association, a small, unassuming building located on the edge of town. It was a place he had avoided for years, preferring to keep his distance from the bureaucracy that seemed to govern his neighbors' lives, but now he had no choice. If anyone knew what had happened to his tree, it was the people in that office. The receptionist greeted him with a forced smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone polite but distant. "I'm here about the oak tree on my property," Frank said, his voice firm. "It's been removed without my permission, and I want to know if the neighborhood association had anything to do with it." The receptionist's smile faltered slightly, but she recovered quickly. "I'm not sure I understand. We don't typically get involved in matters like that." "Don't give me that," Frank said, his patience wearing thin. "Someone removed a 200-year-old tree from my property, and I'm willing to bet you know more about it than you're letting on." Before the receptionist could respond, a voice interrupted from behind. "Is there a problem here?" It was a man in his mid-50s, dressed in a crisp button-down shirt and slacks. His demeanor was calm, but there was a sharpness in his eyes that put Frank on edge. Frank turned to face him. "You tell me. I'm missing a tree, and no one seems to know anything about it." The man introduced himself as Daniel Harper, the head of the neighborhood association. He gestured for Frank to follow him into a small conference room where they could speak privately. Once inside, Daniel sat down and folded his hands neatly on the table. "I understand your frustration, Mr. Wilson, but I can assure you that the association had no involvement in the removal of your tree." Frank leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "Then how do you explain the tire marks on my driveway? Or the fact that someone erased 15 minutes of footage from my security cameras? This wasn't some random act. It was planned and it required resources." Daniel's expression didn't waver, but there was a subtle tension in his posture. "I don't know what to tell you. If you believe a crime has been committed, you should continue working with the authorities." Frank left the office fuming. Daniel's response had been smooth and calculated, but it only reinforced Frank's suspicions. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Someone had taken his tree, and he was going to find out who and why. Frank Wilson's frustration turned into a smoldering resolve. By the time he left the neighborhood association's office, he was sure of one thing: someone was lying. The evasive answers, the forced smiles, and the subtle tension he noticed in Daniel Harper's carefully measured tone all pointed to a deeper scheme. This wasn't the work of random trespassers or rogue contractors. It was a deliberate act orchestrated by someone with the resources, knowledge, and connections to remove a 200-year-old tree without leaving behind any obvious evidence. The fact that the neighborhood association was pretending to know nothing only made him more determined to uncover the truth. Frank spent the rest of the day contacting other local contractors, expanding his search to companies that might have the equipment necessary to remove such a massive tree. The responses were the same: polite confusion, claims of ignorance, and vague promises to check records. He could feel the walls closing in, but he refused to let the dead ends stop him. He wrote down the names of every company he spoke with, cross-referencing them with any other information he could find. His persistence began to pay off when he stumbled upon an unusual detail: a small company listed in a neighboring town had recently filed a permit to transport large organic material across county lines. The timing of the permit coincided almost perfectly with the disappearance of his tree. Without hesitation, Frank called the company. The receptionist who answered sounded young, nervous, and inexperienced. Her voice wavered slightly as Frank introduced himself and explained his reason for calling. "We don't usually handle direct inquiries like this," she said. "Let me check with my supervisor and get back to you." She hung up before Frank could press her further. Something about the conversation didn't sit right with him. The tone of her voice and the rushed way she ended the call suggested she knew more than she was willing to admit. Frank made a note to follow up. The next morning, Frank woke up to find an envelope taped to his front door. It was thick, with no return address, and sealed in a way that made it feel more ominous than any piece of mail he had ever received. Inside, he found a neatly typed letter on plain white paper. The message was short but carried an undeniable threat: for your own good, stop asking questions. Some things are best left alone. There was no signature, no indication of who had sent it, but Frank's blood ran cold. Someone knew what he was doing, and they wanted to scare him into silence. Frank wasn't the kind of man to back down from intimidation. If anything, the letter only fueled his determination. He immediately called his lawyer, Greg, and informed him about the letter. Greg's response was cautious but firm. "Frank, this is serious. Whoever sent that letter is trying to manipulate you. They wouldn't have gone to the trouble if they weren't worried about what you might uncover. I'll file a formal report about this, but in the meantime, you need to be careful. Don't engage directly with anyone you suspect, and document everything." Taking Greg's advice to heart, Frank installed additional cameras around his property that same afternoon. He positioned them to cover blind spots he hadn't considered before, including the edges of his lot where the driveway met the road. He also purchased motion-activated lights and installed them along the perimeter of his property. He wasn't going to let anyone sneak onto his land again without being noticed. Later that evening, Frank received a call from the same small company he had contacted the day before. This time it wasn't the nervous receptionist on the other end of the line, but a man who introduced himself as the company's operations manager. His voice was calm, almost too smooth, as he assured Frank that his company had no involvement in the removal of the tree. "We only handle licensed, above-board projects," the man said. "I'm sorry for any confusion, but we have no record of working in your area recently." Frank could tell the man was lying. The rehearsed tone, the careful choice of words, it all pointed to someone trying to cover their tracks. Frank thanked him politely and ended the call, his suspicions now stronger than ever. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. Frank continued digging into public records, looking for any permits or documents that might reveal who had authorized the tree's removal. He combed through the county's online database and even visited the clerk's office in person. It was there that he discovered something that made his stomach churn: a recently filed zoning proposal that included plans for a new walking trail and community garden. The proposed trail cut directly through his property, right where the oak tree had stood. Frank stared at the documents in disbelief. The zoning proposal was dated 3 weeks before the tree disappeared. It had been submitted by a development firm he didn't recognize, but the application listed the neighborhood association as a partner organization. The implications were clear. The association had been involved in planning changes to his property without his knowledge or consent. Worse, they had likely removed the tree to clear the way for their project. Fuming, Frank scanned the rest of the document. It included maps, timelines, and even budget projections for the proposed development. One section mentioned site preparation, which he realized was a euphemism for clearing obstacles like his oak tree. The audacity of it all was staggering. The association hadn't even bothered to inform him about their plans, let alone seek his approval. They had simply decided that his property was theirs to use as they pleased. Armed with this new evidence, Frank called Greg and sent him copies of the zoning proposal. Greg's reaction was immediate. "This is exactly what we needed," he said. "It proves they had a motive to remove the tree, and it ties them directly to the development plans. This gives us leverage to push back legally. I'll start drafting a formal complaint, and will request a cease and desist order to stop any further action on their part." While Greg worked on the legal front, Frank decided to confront Daniel Harper directly. He showed up unannounced at the neighborhood association's next public meeting, which was held in a small community center near the edge of town. The room was filled with residents, most of whom were there to discuss routine matters like landscaping and noise ordinances. Frank waited patiently until it was his turn to speak. When he stood up, the room fell silent. "I have a question for the board," Frank began, his voice steady but charged with barely concealed anger. "Who gave you the right to plan a development project on my property without my consent?" The silence that followed was deafening. Daniel Harper, seated at the head of the table, maintained his composure but couldn't hide the flicker of unease in his eyes. "I'm not sure what you're referring to, Mr. Wilson," he said, his tone measured. Frank held up a copy of the zoning proposal. "Don't play dumb, Harper. This document lists the association as a partner in a project that includes my land. My tree was removed to make way for your precious walking trail. Care to explain?" A murmur rippled through the room as residents exchanged confused and concerned glances. Daniel's expression hardened, and he leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Wilson, I think there's been a misunderstanding. The association supports projects that benefit the community, but we would never act without proper authorization." "Proper authorization?" Frank shot back. "You didn't even have the decency to inform me, let alone ask for my permission. My property isn't part of your jurisdiction, and you had no right to touch that tree." Before Daniel could respond, another board member spoke up, her voice tinged with nervousness. "Perhaps we should review the records to clarify the situation." "Clarify all you want," Frank said, his voice rising. "But I know exactly what's going on here. You thought you could strong-arm me into compliance, but you made a mistake. That tree was worth more than your entire budget, and I'm not going to let this slide." The meeting ended in chaos, with residents demanding answers and the board scrambling to regain control. Frank left the community center feeling both vindicated and enraged. He had made his point, but he knew this was far from over. The association wouldn't back down easily, and whoever was behind the development plans had too much at stake to give up now. As Frank drove home that night, his mind raced with possibilities. He had exposed their plans and forced them into the open, but what would their next move be? One thing was certain: the battle for his property was only just beginning. Frank's confrontation at the neighborhood meeting was a calculated move, but it hadn't brought him the resolution he had hoped for. Instead, it stirred the pot in a way that made him more uneasy than triumphant. As he drove home that night, he couldn't shake the look on Daniel Harper's face. There had been something in his expression, not quite fear, but a flicker of calculation, as though he was already planning his next move. Frank knew he had poked the hornet's nest, and now he had to be prepared for the swarm. The next morning, Frank received a call from Greg. His lawyer had been busy since Frank handed over the zoning documents and the evidence of the tree's removal. "Frank, I've got some good news and some bad news," Greg began, his tone serious. "The good news is that the cease and desist order is moving forward. We're putting legal pressure on the association to halt all development activity involving your property until this mess is sorted out." "And the bad news?" Frank asked, already bracing himself. "The bad news is that they've filed a counterclaim," Greg said. They're alleging that your property has been improperly maintained and that the tree posed a safety hazard to the surrounding area. According to them, they were within their rights to remove it for the good of the community. Frank felt his stomach twist in anger. "That's ridiculous," he snapped. "They're making this up to cover their tracks." "Of course they are," Greg agreed. "But they're banking on the fact that they can outlast you in a legal battle. This is a classic intimidation tactic. They're trying to make it so expensive and exhausting for you that you'll give up." Frank gritted his teeth. He had no intention of giving up, but he couldn't ignore the reality of the situation. Legal battles were costly, and the neighborhood association had deep pockets. He had saved a modest amount over the years, but the idea of draining his finances to fight them was daunting. "What's our next move?" he asked. "I'm working on it," Greg said, "but I need you to keep gathering evidence. If we can prove that the tree wasn't a hazard and that their actions were premeditated, it'll strengthen our case. Keep an eye on anything unusual. And Frank, be careful. These people are playing dirty." Frank hung up and stared out the window, his jaw clenched. He didn't need Greg to tell him to be careful. The letter taped to his door had been proof enough that his opponents weren't above using underhanded tactics to get what they wanted. Still, he couldn't let fear paralyze him. He had to stay one step ahead. Determined to find more evidence, Frank decided to revisit the small company he had called earlier about the transportation permit. He drove to their listed address, a nondescript warehouse on the outskirts of a neighboring town. The building was quiet, with no signs of activity. Frank parked his truck and walked to the front door, which was locked. A handwritten sign taped to the glass read, "Closed for maintenance." Frank's instincts told him something wasn't right. He circled the building, looking for another way in. Around the back, he found an open gate leading to a lot filled with heavy machinery cranes, bulldozers, and flatbed trucks. The equipment looked well used, and several of the vehicles bore scuff marks and dents consistent with hauling large loads. Frank pulled out his phone and snapped a few photos. He didn't know if this would be useful later, but he wasn't taking any chances. As he was about to leave, he noticed a large dumpster near the edge of the lot. Something about it caught his eye, the edge of a piece of wood protruding from the top, its grain and color strikingly familiar. Frank's heart raced as he walked closer. The wood was thick and dark, and as he pulled it free, he felt a pang of recognition. It was a section of bark from his oak tree. There was no mistaking it. The texture, the weight, even the faint scent of the tree's sap were unmistakable. Frank didn't have time to dwell on the find. A sudden noise, a metallic clang, echoed from somewhere inside the warehouse. He froze, his heart pounding. Someone was inside. He stuffed the piece of bark into his jacket and retreated quickly, glancing over his shoulder as he made his way back to his truck. He didn't stop to think about what might have happened if he'd been caught. All that mattered was getting out of there with the evidence. Back at home, Frank examined the bark more closely. There was no doubt in his mind that it came from his tree. He called Greg immediately and described what he had found. "This is huge," Greg said. "If we can connect that company to the association, it'll blow their whole case apart. We need to find out who hired them and when." Frank felt a surge of determination. For the first time, he felt like he had a real chance of turning the tide. But his optimism was short-lived. That night, as he reviewed the photos he had taken at the warehouse, his power suddenly went out. The house was plunged into darkness, and Frank's first thought was that it was a simple outage. But as he stepped outside to check his breaker, he noticed something strange. The streetlights on the nearby road were still on, as were the lights in his neighbors' houses. The outage was isolated to his property. Frank's unease grew as he approached the side of the house where the breaker was located. The box was open, and the main switch had been flipped. Someone had tampered with it. His first instinct was to call the police, but he hesitated. Without proof of who had done it, the police would likely dismiss it as a random act of vandalism. Instead, he reset the breaker, locked the box, and went back inside. He spent the rest of the night in a state of heightened alert, every creak of the house setting his nerves on edge. The next morning, Frank reviewed the footage from his newly installed cameras. Sure enough, the motion sensors had been triggered late at night. The grainy footage showed a figure in dark clothing moving along the side of the house before disappearing from view. Frank forwarded the video to Greg, who agreed it was more evidence of intimidation. "They're trying to rattle you," Greg said. "Don't let them. This just shows they're getting desperate." Determined to keep pushing forward, Frank decided to reach out to one of his neighbors who had expressed quiet support during the association meeting. Sarah, a retired teacher who lived 2 houses down, had always been friendly but cautious when it came to discussing the association. Frank invited her over for coffee and explained everything that had happened, from the missing tree to the recent power outage. Sarah listened intently, her brow furrowing as Frank laid out the details. When he finished, she sighed and shook her head. "Frank, I've lived here for over 20 years, and I've seen how this association operates. They'll do whatever it takes to get what they want. But what you're describing, it's worse than anything I've ever seen." "Do you know anything about the development plans?" Frank asked. Sarah hesitated, glancing toward the window as though checking to make sure they weren't being overheard. "I've heard rumors," she said finally. "They've been trying to push for a new community project for years, but they've always hit roadblocks because of zoning issues. Your property is one of the last pieces they need to make it work. I wouldn't be surprised if they decided to take matters into their own hands." Frank felt a surge of vindication. He wasn't imagining things. The association was behind this, and now he had confirmation from someone who had been watching them for years. Sarah agreed to provide a written statement for Greg, though she made it clear she didn't want to be dragged into the spotlight. "I'll help however I can," she said, "but I can't afford to make enemies. I've got my own battles to fight with them." As Sarah left, Frank felt a renewed sense of purpose. He was still outnumbered and outmatched, but he wasn't alone. Every piece of evidence, every ally he found brought him closer to the truth. The battle was far from over, but for the first time, Frank felt like he was gaining ground. And he wasn't about to stop now. Frank's fight was beginning to feel like a war of attrition, and each new development only added to the growing weight on his shoulders. The revelation that the neighborhood association was actively targeting his property had lit a fire in him, but it had also confirmed his worst fears. These people weren't just playing games. They were organized, determined, and more than willing to resort to underhanded tactics to achieve their goals. The tampering with his breaker box had been the most direct and menacing act yet, and it left Frank in a state of constant vigilance. Sleep came fitfully, if at all, and every shadow seemed to hold the promise of another intrusion. He wasn't paranoid, he was preparing. A few days after Sarah's visit, Greg called with an update. "Frank, we've got a bit of a breakthrough," he said. "I was able to trace the transportation permit you mentioned earlier, and it looks like it was issued to a subcontractor connected to that small company you visited. The same one with the equipment in the lot." "Let me guess," Frank said grimly. "They're tied to the neighborhood association." "Indirectly," Greg replied. "The subcontractor has been working with a larger development firm for years, and that firm has a history of involvement with community improvement projects that, shall we say, benefit certain board members financially. I've got someone digging deeper into the connection. But it's clear there's a pattern. They push zoning changes, claim it's for the good of the neighborhood, and then funnel contracts to companies they're tied to. Your property and your tree were just the next step in their plan." Frank felt a surge of anger. It wasn't just about the tree anymore. This was about corruption, plain and simple. "What's the next step?" he asked. "I'm working on filing an injunction to stop the development," Greg said. "But we need to be strategic. They're going to fight this tooth and nail, and they're banking on you running out of steam before they do. You have to be ready for them to escalate." Greg's warning proved prophetic. The very next day, Frank received a letter in the mail, a formal notice from the neighborhood association, citing him for multiple violations of community standards. The list was absurd: overgrown grass, improper fencing, unauthorized outdoor storage, and even the unaesthetic appearance of his mailbox. It was clear retaliation for his resistance, and the penalties were steep. The letter threatened fines, liens, and potential legal action if he didn't comply within 30 days. Frank stared at the notice in disbelief. His property was meticulously maintained, and anyone who had seen it would know these claims were fabricated. This was nothing more than an attempt to pressure him into submission, a blatant abuse of power. But he also knew it wasn't something he could ignore. If they filed liens against his property, it could complicate his legal case and give them more leverage. He needed to act quickly. He called Greg and read the letter to him over the phone. "This is a classic intimidation tactic," Greg said. "They're trying to bury you in red tape and distract you from the bigger fight. We can challenge it, but it's going to take time." "Time isn't something I feel like I have," Frank replied. "What happens if they start filing liens before we can stop them?" "It's unlikely they'll succeed," Greg said, though his tone held a note of caution. "But it's not impossible. The best thing you can do is document everything and make sure you're in full compliance with local ordinances. Don't give them any ammunition." Frank spent the next week meticulously going over every inch of his property. He measured his grass, checked his fencing, and even repainted his mailbox to eliminate any potential points of contention. He took photos of everything and kept detailed records, determined to leave no room for the association to twist the narrative. It was tedious, infuriating work, but it gave him a sense of control in an otherwise chaotic situation. While he was busy defending his property, the association was stepping up its efforts to undermine him. Anonymous complaints began flooding local code enforcement, resulting in repeated visits from inspectors. One claimed that Frank's driveway was improperly graded, while another suggested that his garden shed violated setback requirements. Each complaint was baseless, but the sheer volume of them was overwhelming. Frank began to wonder how far the association was willing to go and what they were hoping to gain by wearing him down. One evening, as he was reviewing his records, his phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. The message was short but alarming. "I think you should know there was a meeting tonight, and they were talking about you. Something about filing a formal complaint with the city. Be careful." Frank's stomach dropped. If the association was involving the city in their campaign against him, it could escalate the situation even further. He needed to get ahead of them before they could solidify their claims. Frank decided to take a more proactive approach. He reached out to a local investigative journalist, someone he had met years ago during a zoning dispute in another part of town. The journalist, a sharp and relentless woman named Ellen, had a reputation for exposing corruption in local government and community organizations. Frank laid out his story for her, from the removal of the tree to the retaliatory tactics the association had employed. Ellen listened intently, her pen scratching across a notepad as he spoke. When he finished, she leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. "This isn't the first time I've heard complaints about that association," she said. "They've been involved in some shady dealings before, but nothing this blatant. If what you're saying is true and from the evidence you've shown me, it looks like it is they're playing a dangerous game. I'd be happy to dig into this, but I need to warn you once this goes public. They're going to come at you even harder." "I'm already in their crosshairs," Frank replied. "What's a little more pressure?" Ellen smiled wryly. "Fair enough. I'll start making calls." While Ellen began her investigation, Frank focused on shoring up his defenses. He installed additional security measures, including reinforced locks and motion-detecting floodlights. He also began keeping a detailed journal of every interaction he had with the association, from letters and inspections to the suspicious activity around his property. If this ever went to court, he wanted to have an airtight case. The pressure from the association continued to mount. One night, Frank was woken by the sound of his motion detectors going off. He grabbed a flashlight and went outside, his pulse racing. As he scanned the yard, he spotted a figure disappearing into the darkness beyond the property line. Whoever it was had been careful not to trigger the cameras, but the message was clear. They wanted him to know they were watching. The next morning, he found a new notice taped to his door. This one was even more aggressive than the last, accusing him of obstructing community progress and threatening to escalate the matter to legal action if he didn't cease his uncooperative behavior. Frank laughed bitterly as he read it. The sheer audacity of their claims would have been almost impressive if it weren't so infuriating. Ellen called later that day with an update. "I've uncovered some interesting connections," she said. "The development firm behind the zoning proposal has ties to one of the association board members, a financial connection that they didn't disclose when the proposal was submitted. It looks like they stand to make a lot of money if this project goes through. That doesn't surprise me, Frank said. But how do we prove it? I'm working on that, Ellen replied. But I need more time. In the meantime, keep documenting everything. The more evidence we have, the better. Frank thanked her and hung up, feeling a mix of frustration and determination. He was fighting a battle on multiple fronts against the association, the developers, and the creeping sense of isolation that came with being targeted. But he wasn't about to give up. This was his home, his land, and his fight. And no matter how long it took, he was going to see it through to the end. Frank Wilson had been bracing himself for the inevitable showdown ever since he'd received the first retaliatory notice from the neighborhood association. The escalating harassment, the fabricated complaints, and the veiled threats had all been calculated to push him to his breaking point. But if the association's goal was to force him into submission, they had underestimated him. Frank had spent weeks fortifying his case, gathering evidence, and preparing himself for whatever they might throw at him next. The stakes had risen far beyond a missing tree. This was now about standing his ground and exposing the corruption that had taken root in his community. The summons to the city council meeting arrived on a Monday morning, delivered in a crisp envelope with the association's logo embossed in gold. The letter inside was predictably condescending, informing Frank that the council would be reviewing a formal complaint regarding his failure to comply with community standards. The association had evidently decided to escalate their campaign against him to the highest level, hoping to force the city's hand in supporting their development plans. Frank read the letter twice, his jaw tightening as he absorbed the implications. This wasn't just an attempt to undermine him. It was a declaration of war. He immediately called Greg, who listened calmly as Frank described the contents of the letter. "This is exactly what we've been preparing for," Greg said. "They're trying to paint you as a problem neighbor to justify their actions. But we've got the evidence to counter their claims. We'll show the council what's really going on." The meeting was scheduled for Thursday evening, giving Frank only a few days to finalize his preparations. Greg assured him that their case was strong, but Frank couldn't shake the nagging feeling that the association might have another trick up their sleeve. He spent those days reviewing every piece of evidence they had collected, from the photos of his meticulously maintained property to the zoning documents that tied the association to the development firm. Ellen's investigation had uncovered even more damning information: financial records showing that several board members had received payments from the developers under the guise of consulting fees. It was a clear conflict of interest, and Frank intended to make sure the council heard every sordid detail. When Thursday arrived, Frank felt a mixture of nerves and determination as he walked into the city council chamber. The room was already packed with residents, many of whom had shown up out of curiosity or to support the association. At the front of the room, the council members sat behind a long table, their expressions neutral as they reviewed the agenda. Frank spotted Daniel Harper seated with the other board members near the front of the room. The man's demeanor was as polished as ever, but there was a tension in his posture that hadn't been there before. Frank knew he wasn't the only one feeling the pressure. The meeting began with the usual procedural matters: approval of minutes, public comments on unrelated issues, but Frank barely registered any of it. His focus was on the moment when his case would be called. When the council chair finally announced the agenda item, Frank straightened in his seat, his heart pounding as Daniel Harper rose to speak. "Members of the council," Harper began, his tone measured and authoritative. "We are here today to address a matter of great concern to our community. Mr. Wilson's continued disregard for neighborhood standards has created significant challenges for the association and its residents. His property has been the subject of numerous complaints, and his refusal to cooperate with our efforts to maintain a safe and harmonious environment has left us no choice but to seek your intervention." Harper's words were smooth, almost rehearsed, and they elicited murmurs of agreement from some of the residents in attendance. But Frank noticed something else: a few skeptical glances exchanged among the council members. They weren't buying Harper's performance as easily as he might have hoped. When Harper finished, the council chair turned to Frank. "Mr. Wilson, you've heard the concerns raised by the association. Do you have a response?" Frank stood, his hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. "Yes, I do," he said, his voice firm but measured. What you've just heard is a carefully crafted narrative designed to distract from the real issue. This isn't about community standards or my property. It's about a group of people abusing their power for personal gain. He took a deep breath and began presenting his evidence, starting with the photographs of his property. As you can see, my land is well maintained. The claims of overgrown grass, improper fencing, and other violations are completely baseless. These complaints were fabricated as part of a coordinated effort to harass me into compliance. Frank then shifted to the zoning documents, holding up the maps and proposals that had been filed without his knowledge or consent. This is the real reason we're here tonight. The association has been working with a development firm to push through a project that would require using my property without my permission. They removed a 200-year-old oak tree valued at $75,000 to clear the way for their plans, and they did it without any legal authority. As Frank spoke, he noticed the council members leaning forward, their expressions growing more serious. He saved the most damning evidence for last, the financial records Ellen had uncovered. These documents show that several board members, including Mr. Harper, have received payments from the development firm. These payments were disguised as consulting fees, but they're nothing more than bribes to secure their cooperation. The room erupted into murmurs, and Harper's composure visibly cracked for the first time. He stood abruptly, his face red with anger. "This is a baseless accusation," he snapped. "You have no proof." "Sit down, Mr. Harper," the council chair said sharply, cutting him off. "We'll hear from you after Mr. Wilson has finished." Frank pressed on, laying out the timeline of events and the connections between the association and the developers. By the time he finished, the council chamber was silent, the weight of his evidence hanging heavily in the air. The council chair turned to Harper, her expression steely. "Mr. Harper, do you have a response to these allegations?" Harper faltered, his polished demeanor unraveling under the scrutiny. He stammered out a denial, but it was clear that his credibility had been severely damaged. The other board members looked equally shaken, their earlier confidence replaced with visible discomfort. After a brief recess, the council reconvened to announce their decision. "In light of the evidence presented, we find that the neighborhood association has acted inappropriately in its dealings with Mr. Wilson. The zoning proposal will be rejected, and we are recommending an independent investigation into the association's financial practices." The room erupted into a mixture of applause and angry muttering. Frank felt a wave of relief wash over him as the council chair continued. "Mr. Wilson, we apologize for the stress this has caused you, and we encourage you to pursue further legal action if necessary. This kind of behavior has no place in our community." As the meeting adjourned, Frank stood outside the chamber, taking in the cool evening air. He had won this battle, but he knew the war wasn't over. The association's corruption would take time to fully unravel, and there was still the matter of holding them accountable for the damage they had done. But for the first time in weeks, Frank felt a sense of hope. He had stood his ground and exposed the truth, and he wasn't about to stop now. The aftermath of the city council meeting sent shockwaves through the neighborhood, and Frank Wilson felt the weight of both victory and exhaustion pressing down on him. The decision to reject the zoning proposal had been a crucial win, but it had also ignited a firestorm. The neighborhood association, once smug and untouchable, was now under intense scrutiny. Residents who had blindly trusted them were beginning to ask questions, and those who had been quietly suffering under their control finally saw an opportunity to push back. But Frank knew better than to assume the fight was over. Wounded animals were often the most dangerous, and he doubted Daniel Harper and his cronies would slink away without a final attempt to salvage their power. The very next morning, Frank was woken by the sound of a car idling just outside his property. He peered out his window and saw a black SUV parked near his driveway. The tinted windows made it impossible to see who was inside, but the intent was clear: this was intimidation. He didn't bother calling the police. He knew from experience that they wouldn't arrive in time, and even if they did, whoever was watching him would be long gone. Instead, he walked outside, his stance deliberate and unwavering. As soon as he stepped onto his porch, the SUV slowly pulled away, disappearing down the road. A message, plain and simple: we're still watching. Frank refused to be rattled. If anything, their desperation only reassured him that he had struck a nerve. He spent the next few days working closely with Greg, ensuring that every loose end was tied up. Greg had already begun drafting a lawsuit against the association for property damage and harassment, and Frank was eager to move forward. He wanted them to feel the consequences of their actions, to make sure they couldn't simply retreat and regroup for another attempt at seizing his land. Meanwhile, Ellen's investigation continued to unearth even more damning details. Several other homeowners had come forward, sharing stories of unexplained fines, sudden zoning changes, and suspiciously timed foreclosures that had forced long-term residents out of the neighborhood. What had happened to Frank wasn't an isolated case, it was part of a much larger pattern of corruption and abuse. Ellen compiled her findings into a detailed report, which she planned to publish within the week. The pressure on the association was mounting, and Frank could sense the walls closing in around them. Then, late one evening, Greg called with news that made Frank's breath catch. Harper resigned, he said without preamble. Effective immediately. He sent a letter to the city council this afternoon. Frank sat heavily in his chair, absorbing the unexpected development. Just like that, he asked, skepticism creeping into his voice. Not quite, Greg replied. From what I've heard, he didn't have much of a choice. The city is launching an audit of the association's finances, and at least one of the board members is cooperating. They're trying to cut their losses before the whole thing blows up. Frank exhaled slowly, processing the implications. Harper stepping down was significant, but it didn't erase the damage that had been done. The association still existed, and the systems they had manipulated for years wouldn't change overnight. But it was a start. The following day, Frank received another unexpected visitor, Sarah, the neighbor who had quietly supported him throughout the ordeal. She arrived at his doorstep carrying a small box, her expression unreadable. I thought you might want this, she said, handing it over. Frank opened the box and felt his throat tighten. Inside was a small section of wood, polished and carefully preserved. It was a piece of his oak tree. I found it in my yard after they cut it down, Sarah explained. I don't know why I kept it, but it felt wrong to throw it away. Frank ran his fingers over the wood, feeling the familiar grain beneath his touch. It wasn't much, but it was something, a tangible piece of what had been stolen from him. He nodded, swallowing against the lump in his throat. Thank you, he said simply. In the days that followed, the neighborhood association continued to unravel. More board members resigned, and a temporary oversight committee was put in place to manage the transition. Several residents who had been vocal supporters of the association suddenly became much quieter, distancing themselves from the scandal. The development firm that had been backing the project quietly pulled out, unwilling to risk further legal complications. The walking trail and community garden plans were officially abandoned. Frank spent more time outside now, reclaiming the land that had been at the center of so much conflict. He had already begun the process of planting a new tree, not to replace the one he had lost, because that was impossible, but to mark a new chapter. He chose a young oak, knowing it would take decades to reach the size of its predecessor, but that didn't matter. What mattered was that it was his, and no one would ever take it from him again. One evening, as he sat on his porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, his phone buzzed with a message from Greg. It was simple, just 3 words: we won. Frank. Frank leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. The fight had been long and brutal, but in the end he had held his ground. He had stood against corruption, against intimidation, against those who believed they could take whatever they wanted without consequence. And he had won.